Hello, Big Bad Con friends. I'm so excited to be able to say that. Welcome to seeing yourself in the game. I almost said my podcast name. Seeing yourself in the game. This is going to be a podcast about representation in board games. But I want to preface this by saying that this conversation is equally important and is also happening at this con on the RPG side. The representation, we're talking about it in the narrow focus of board games for the most part. We have a little bit of RPG stuff here, but it is also equally important in the RPG world. I am going to, it is for another 50 minutes here in California. It is Trans Day of Visibility. And so trans friends, I just want to say we see you, we love you, and we support you. That, and it's not just one day. Every day should be Trans Day of Visibility. So we have amazing people here to tell you amazing things. So I'm going to stop talking. Dr. Pobuda, why don't you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm Dr. Tanya Pobuda. I'm a Canadian researcher who specializes in board games. I'm also a drone pilot because I made a bet with some folks I work with in my lab. I do AI and VR stuff. And I've been studying board games for about 6 years.
She literally wrote the doctoral thesis, which is probably longer than the book and better edited. We'll be talking about that in a minute. KC, tell us about yourself.
I'm Casey. I'm a game designer from Nigeria. I'm also the founder and creative director of Nipcat Games. Nipcat Games is a company in Nigeria that focuses solely on creating awareness on board games, tabletop games generally. In the past, we've supported people to design their own games, which I'm sure I will talk more about during this conversation. We also started the first in at the time the first convention, tabletop games convention in Nigeria, and also with the help of the global community, opened the first cafe that focuses solely on board games. So yeah.
It's huge. And I love that you've got the Catan right there. You're just, slid
Yeah.
that in there. Cal, tell us about yourself. Whoop, you're on mute, Cal. Wow, now it's a Zoom meeting.
I thought to myself before we started, I should definitely mute myself, just in case anything happens. And I was very smart. My name is Calvin. I write for board games. I do a lot of behind-the-scenes industry stuff. I'm currently designing a couple of games. Work in RPGs too. Do a lot of rule books. Do a lot of cultural consulting. Have been into seriously into board games for the last 10 years or so. It's great. Board games are great. And I'm really happy to be here with.
That's our panel. Board games are great.
Yeah.
So I want to start with sort of setting a baseline here. And Dr. Pobuda, and I'll finally say your name right. How many times have we talked and I've said your name wrong every single time? My goodness. So Dr. Pobuda, if you'll sort of set us up here talking about some of the scholarship that you've done around representation in board games.
Absolutely. Because I am a prop presenter, I'm going to just share my screen and show you just a few slides. I promise it will not be a lecture.
By the way, while she's setting this up, I want to shout out all of the Twitch producers and moderators who are working here on Big Bad Con to let all of this great stuff happen.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Loading.
Excellent.
Yes.
All right, so just really quickly, just like Ezra shared, I wrote an entire dissertation about representation in board games. It's 230 pages, and I finished it late last year, graduated and everything. I'm a baby PhD now. And really what I looked at was intersectionality of gender, race, orientation, and ability in board games. We're going to focus in on gender and race for the purposes of this presentation. I found I did a lot of extensive research, and essentially the big finding was just the real skew in board gaming toward whiteness and maleness. So this is what I look like when it's not 2 o'clock in the morning my time. I'm based here in Toronto. And one of the big things is I worked in market research for decades, doing lots of work for evil corporations, working in multinational agencies. And one of the big things that I used to do was dashboards. I would count things. I would look at, market impacts, audience research, demography, how to attract an audience. And I did that for big brands for, again, literally decades. And what I wanted to do was look at board games as as a marketing vehicle, as an experience, as a place where people make space for one another. And what I found was very analogous to the Annenberg study for film and television, where they looked at the faces in front of the camera, who gets speaking lines, who doesn't, who works in the film industry and television. And I kind of wanted to make an analogous study for board games. So the first thing I wanted to look at was, who are the designers? And again, this mirrors a lot of demographic research that happens in publishing, in tenured profs, in boards of directors. And what I did was I looked at the top 400 board game geek ranked games, and I looked at who made those games, who was the designers listed in association with those top 400 games. And I got to say, just, my positionality is I'm a middle-aged white woman. I grew up in northern Alberta, in Canada, in the tundra. And I had a slightly rosier thought about what my findings might be. I thought that things had gotten better since I started playing board games in the 70s and 80s. But what you can see here is 92.6% of the designers of the top 400 games were white male identified. And that required a lot of research on my part to kind of look at the racial backgrounds, the gender identification of the designers. And what you can see here is white women representing. Some of these are double counts, 16 people within that top 400, 540 white men, 24 BIPOC men. Most of them are Eric Lang, because this is a double count, and white non-binary in that mix. So you can see there's a real skew there. And that's something that's quite fascinating to me as a researcher, is when a representative sample does not mirror or map to population, that means something's acting against it to prevent it from reflecting the population, because reference samples should map to population, but in this case it doesn't, right? So the top 200 Board Game Geek Rank games, this required me counting with other coders all of the figures on all of the top 200 Board Game Geek Rank games. This was almost 2,000 figures, and it required a lot of research, in some cases magnifying glasses. And I was looking at the covers as a marketing vehicle, right? A cover tends to be, you're making a purchase evaluation. The cover is the thing that you might see first. And what you can see here is within the covers of human representation on the board game artwork, it was quite heavily skewed to whiteness, or white presenting figures at 82.5%. And only 17.5% of the representation on the board game covers were Black, Indigenous, persons of color. And one of the things that was out of scope for my research, but is a big factor in the feedback I got from my research, was the representation wasn't always positive. And in fact, in many cases, it was quite negative, and there were tropes and sexist, racist representation in that mix. So that's the skew toward whiteness. And then 76.8% of all of the human representation on the board game covers were of men or boys, and only 23.2% were that of women or girls in terms of representation. So a skew toward whiteness and maleness, and publishing game design skew as well. And you're more likely to see a creature that does not exist than you are to see a human woman on a board game cover. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to check on with this research, so I did the counts, and that was kind of my empirical level set to figure out, okay, what's the state of play of representation on board game arts in the terms of the labor of board games? You can see that there's a really heavy skew. But And there was other research that I looked at, like Gaming on the Edge by Dr. Adrian Shaw, which is a really great book about LGBTQ plus identification in video gaming primarily. And what Adrian Shaw discovered was no community is a monolith. People have very different relationships with representation, and her findings were that it's very complicated. Does representation matter to communities? So I asked 320 participants who board gamed at least once a week at 70.7%. So these are really dedicated, diehard board gamers. What they told me, and this was a Likert scale, which is basically a market research thing. You probably filled them out tons of times, which is strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and then strongly disagree. And, I gave them a series of statements. There were so many. It was 123 questions in my survey. And questions like these, or statements like these, do you agree or disagree with them? The board gaming industry is dominated by white men. And we got really, really high levels of agreement. And in market research, in the decades that I've been in it, it's rare that you see this level of passion. Strongly agree at 61.9%. So very, very high passionate agreement, and 27.7% agree. So really, really high, overwhelmingly, obviously the overwhelming majority. And again, rare that you see that level of passion of the participants. And so these were not new gamers by any stretch of the imagination. 53.5% of them gamed for more than 11 years. So more than half. 60.4% of the respondents identified as women. So I really recruited very, very actively for diversity. What's fascinating, and I was really looking at the US and Canada as the kind of seats of my research. There are more women in the US and Canada than there are men, by a slight majority. And so you can see here at 60.4%, the respondents identified as women. And my goal with this research was really to get the voices of people that aren't always represented in other publishing surveys or census type activities within board gaming, which is a really tricky thing to get. This, of course, this number includes trans women because trans women are women. This was a little lower than I wanted it to be. At 20.4% of the respondents identified as Black, Indigenous persons of color. And so you can see that the majority of the sample identified as white, and at 78.3%. And this is why, and I say this now because you're going to see some really interesting perspectives. Now, what was really tremendous about this is I recruited on Reddit, Board Game Geek, Facebook, Twitter, all of the places where I thought I would find board gamers. Overwhelmingly, this sample came from Board Game Geek. And that was a really heartening finding. It's actually one of the key findings in my dissertation. Everyone talks about board game bros. It's a terminology, a term of art in board gaming. And they say, well, board game bros, board game geek users tend to be white and male. This was all from Board Game Geek. All of these respondents came from Board Game Geek. And what it told me was Board Game Geek has an incredible community and sets of communities within it that are really, really diverse and are extremely dedicated. A lot of people came back and told me, I lurk. I don't tend to engage with Board Game Geek. I go to certain fora on Board Game Geek, and I'm not necessarily vocal or active because it's not always easy to do that on Board Game Geek, as I can attest. 52.8% of the respondents identified as LGBTQ+, which I thought was really, really cool. So the thing that I was asking is, okay, we got the state of play of representation. This is what the artwork looks like. This is what the labor looks like. What is it like to go to gaming spaces? What is representation like there? And what happens when you go to board gaming spaces, particularly public ones? And in this case, it was a 1 in 3. So about a third of the respondents said, yes, I have experienced homophobic remarks while participating in the board gaming hobby. The other thing was gendered name calling and insults about gender while participating in board gaming. And there's another example of a sort of 1 in 3 situation where folks were saying that is a common occurrence at about a third of the respondents. The other thing I got was a lot of stories from people who had been gaming but didn't feel comfortable sharing this stuff publicly. My survey was covered by a board of ethics, people, and I wasn't selling anything. I'm not a publisher. I let everybody know that they were very safe to share perspectives with me because everything was anonymized. The data was stored very safely. So I did get hundreds of stories and comments that folks wrote in during the process of filling out the survey. This was actually a comment to one of my postings of my survey where the person said, our local board game convention is whiter than Wonder Bread, and the game designer club I attend has an all-male attendance 95% of the time. So it's an issue in the industry. This was another one, and a lot of stories, so many that I can't go through all of them, but these are some of the big themes. This is a person talking about teaching at board game conventions, and that kind of the discrimination of lowered expectations. This person identified as a woman, and they said they're highly respected at their local convention, and people come to me if they want to learn an awesome game. Yes, there are guys who don't believe me at first and make it tough, but when they realize I'm the only one with the answer they needed about the game, they realize I'm not as dim-witted as they thought. And this was a very common comment from particularly people who identified as women or non-binary, that they were getting a lot of incredulity about their board gaming cred and their ability to teach games and participate in gaming. This was another one that really bothered me. This was a person who identified as Indigenous saying, I'm never going to see Indigenous people represented as anything other than barbarians in need of civilization. I've stopped caring for the most part because if I cared, I'd be mad all the time, and I don't have the mental energy for that anymore. This was another really key theme because a lot of people are making do with what they have because they love to game. This is very similar to Adrian Shaw's findings that people were sort of, well, what are you going to do? I love to game. I don't love the representation, but I'm going to do it anyway because I care about gaming. People are settling for what's available right now. And that's not a healthy sign for a sector. This one was a really, really interesting one as well, very similar to the previous comment where and this person said the other thing that needs to be addressed is the laziness of stereotypes for races. Themes that seem cool but miss the mark. Needs to be investigation into whether companies and designers actually seek out experts when it comes to themes. And this is a great segue into Kelvin's presentation. Just because I'm Black doesn't mean you have to do it about slavery. It doesn't mean that you're a drug dealer, thug, etc. So lazy tropes and stereotypes that have an incredibly negative impact on gaming spaces. It doesn't feel good to play games that have lazy, negative, harmful tropes. The other big thing was just, again, that sort of space making issue. How inclusive are places? And, what is it like to play games? And this was a really overwhelming level of agreement that incivility is quite common. Being interrupted, talked over, talked down to, dismissed and ignored. Remember that this is a very diverse sample, relatively speaking to other board game surveys, and people were feeling disrespected in a lot of board gaming spaces. This is another really interesting, quite troubling finding about unwelcome sexual advances while participating in the board gaming hobby. I watch a lot of feedback around conventions, and this is a far too common occurrence in a 1 in 3 kind of situation with a level of agreement that was pretty high. This one, and this is the last one, this is a real alarm bell, I think, for the entire industry. Before the global pandemic, I sometimes felt out of place when I attended board gaming events outside of my home. And that's a real concern. So people don't feel necessarily 100% great about being in the spaces, and they're making do with the games they have available to us. So this last one, just landing on this, I love this quote. This is from A. George, and it's called, this is a blog post called Gaming's Race Problem. And they say, for many of us, gaming is not simply a hobby, but a home. Let's make it both inclusive and diverse. And that's the goal with my research. That's the goal with this panel. And
the goal with Big Bad Con.
The goal with Big Bad Con. And that is my presentation. So you can get in touch with me on Twitter. I should have put my Mastodon and Spoutable, but I forgot.
We've literally just scratched the surface of your work here.
Yes.
You can, if you follow Tanya Twitter. You'll get tastes of her research as it goes out, and she shows up on podcasts all over the place talking about this. Tanya, I mean, your scholarship, I think, is kind of solitary in this space, and I'd love to see similar scholarship. I think RPGs need a Tanya Pobeda to go and do this kind of study in the RPG world as well.
I am thinking about that, and I have to say that I want to thank the panelists, Calvin and Casey. You have inspired my research. I think about you all the time in terms of the work that I'd like to continue to do, and it's such an honor to be here.
Well, that sounds like a segue. Cal, Dr. Pobeda talked a little bit about the importance of sensitivity readers and sort of cultural, having people from the culture vetting things. You've been a cultural consultant. What's that process like?
So a cultural consultant is basically somebody that you bring in on the design process to advise you about details of a culture that you don't really know a lot about. So it doesn't have to specifically, there's an overlap with, but there's not entirely the same job as a sensitivity reader. A sensitivity reader is like, okay, so I'll give you an example. There's one game that I'm working on right now. It's a card game. And every card has, art on it, right? And the company is sending me the art and saying, is there anything, offensive about this? Is there anything weird? And I have said before, and I have pushed back on some of these things, it's a little strange that you make the only fat character in this art, look like this. It's a little strange that this female character is portrayed as, running, but she's also wearing stilettos. So it's little things like this that are just unconscious biases that people have when they do things, right? And ideally, this is something that a lot of publishers do I think need to be more careful about. Ideally, they would have caught these things in the art direction stage before the artist was briefed, before the illustration was made. They spent all that time, and then they sent it to me and said, "Hey, can we get some gut checks on this?" And I'm like, "Well, now you're gonna have to spend time to redo these." And there was another game that I did where.
How willing are they to redo it? Is there pushback?
Oh, no. If they've gone through if they've gone to the trouble to actually hire and pay me, they listen. They listen to what I'm saying. They were like, and I mean, when I do things, I'm also, because I have learned a lot about the industry by being behind the scenes, and I know about things like production costs and timelines, and every time I push back on something, it's time, right? It's time that's taken away from the rest of the production. So I try to grade my things in levels of severity when I talk about them. It's so I say, point out, for example, okay, so this character's hair isn't quite right, but this is a fantasy universe, we can kind of get away with it, severity is low. We don't have to fix it, but if we do fix it, that would be great. But then if I have any major reds, I remember writing once in a thing for the game, this cannot make it to the final game. You will look really bad. You have to change this. If you take nothing away from the rest of this 5-page, 6-page document that I created, you cannot let this one thing go. And they changed it, And they changed it. It wasn't actually a particularly difficult change, art-wise, but it's good that they listened to it, because the idea here is that what makes me qualified to do these things is just listening to various groups about their concerns. It's listening to dark-skinned people, because colorism is a thing. It's listening to women because sexism is a thing. It's listening to transgender people because transphobia is a thing. So because I am none of those things, but I have knowledge of these issues, because I think one of my skills, not just as a consultant or as a reader, but I think as a person, is that I'm pretty willing to listen to and like intake feedback from other things. So from other groups and other people, because I've always had a fascination with learning about stuff, right? And when I was young, that was like learning about rocket ships and learning about physics and reading science books and like books about airplanes. But today it's learning about transgender issues, it's learning about indigenous issues, and it's still fascinating to me because these are the science behind it and the thought, as you can see with the doctor's slides previously, the amount of thought, the amount of work that goes into this research is no less invaluable than the people who work to build rockets to send us to the moon. In fact, it's harder in some ways because we know how to build a rocket, like it's a known quantity, but we don't currently have a solution for like the irrationalities of human behavior and biases. So that's what sensitivity reads and cultural consultants do. Why is it important in the industry? Because as the doctor's slide showed, there is a disparity, there is a gap, right? And she mentioned Eric Lang, who is one of the few high-profile non-white designers. By POC, by the way, in case you all don't know, is a very American-centric term. Nobody uses it outside the US. Like in the UK, they use BAME, I think Black, African, and Middle Eastern. Over here, it doesn't. Neither of those terms really exist. I like non-white. Non-white is the term that I use. So Eric reached out to me, and now I'm designing a game with him. As it's going to be my first published design. It's going to be announced hopefully later this year. But that's what that's what people in the industry can do, right? Like they can reach out, they can have proteges, they can mentor people, use your power, right? And cultural sensitivity is one of those ways. You're transferring power to people by getting them to tell you, oh, this is bad, this is good, do this, and you're paying them money to do it. But why stop there, right? Why not let them design their games? Why not create, if you're a publisher, right? Why don't you open up a slot in your roster for like, try to get in, non-men game designers? Why don't you try to get in non-white game designers, non-American game designers, if you're an American company, Eastern Hemisphere game designers, and using your power for that would help, bring up the tide, lift the boats, and also normalize it. What if a giant, like for example Fantasy Flight, started doing exactly what I was suggesting earlier. Fantasy Flight, by the way, as one of the big leaders in our industry, has been doing a lot for diversity inside their games. It's a little more difficult for their hiring process because they're located in the Midlands of the United States.
Minnesota, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Minnesota's not the worst state as far as I understand. I've never been to the US. All my information is like secondhand from my friends who live and work there. Minnesota's not bad. Minnesota's not bad, they tell me, in terms of like diversity and like being not the worst place to live in terms of how safe they feel and how threatened they feel.
Have you seen any change with Fantasy Flight's policies as they got consumed by Asmodee?
Okay, so the Asmodee thing actually hasn't really been that big a deal. I think the bigger thing was that most of the previous leadership left and was replaced by newer leadership who, from my understanding, are much more open to issues like this. I think one of their more recent releases, Unfathomable, which is like a Arkham horror-esque game about being on a boat and then the boat is attacked by terrors from the deep, features quite a lot of diverse characters because there's like a deaf character, there's I think at least 2 trans characters. There's a lot of dark-skinned people on that boat that you can play as. There's a lot of non-men as well. So the idea here is that I think they are working very hard to at least in their games, push that, right? And you can say, okay, you can go further. Of course, you can go further. You can hire better. You can, you can use that power that you have to amplify things. But that's a long-term process, right? Like even if today every publisher went and hired, a non-man, a non-white person, a non-Western Hemisphere person to do a game for them, you wouldn't see that for the next 3 or 4 years, because that's how long some games take to come out. And that's just how it is. So, but the idea here is that if you are at a position in the industry and you have power, right, and you have something that you can do about it, even if it's something small, like for example, I've done some consultation work for FFG before. Sorry, not consultation. I've written some stuff for FFG before, like I wrote some short stories for them, and little things like if you see my name in the thing here, I've written my entire name. That's how I want to be credited, because I want people with Chinese names to be able to see themselves in the game industry. Hopefully when my game with Eric Lang comes out, that'll be on the front of the box, and that'll be pretty cool. When FFG hired me and they sent over their like contract and their form, for me to fill out as part of their thing, the form asks first name, middle name, last name. And I'm like, I don't have a middle name. What do I do? Most of these here are not first name or middle name. How do I, how is your database going to format my name? So Calvin is my given name. Wong is my family name. Zerlun is also a given name, but it's not a first name, is it? Because it's not coming first. So even the term first name is an assumption. They're given to so because of hiring me, they had to update their entire freelancer database entry system to actually accommodate a different name format, that they were used to. And I know that a lot of my Asian colleagues in the United States and Canada, North America, they format their names to be friendly to the most famous example of this, I think, is the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. lady, Ming-Na, right? Her name on IMDb is Ming-Na Wen. That's not how she was born. She would have been born Wen Ming-Na, but she changed the order so that it would be friendlier for white Americans, to grasp the name order. I don't think you should have to do that. I don't think you should have to change like your name to suit like someone else's preferences. I mean, it's something as basic in identification as your actual like name, right? So I don't think you should have to. Yeah. So it's things like that, right? Getting used to name structures, getting used to cultures, getting used to little things that aren't yours. Like for example, if I go to a board game convention, do you have a prayer room for any Muslim attendants, right? Do you have daycare for any attendants who are coming with children? If you don't, then you are subconsciously locking out a certain group of people from doing their thing. Do you have quiet rooms for those with auditory processing disorders or other sensory disorders, right? Do you have any of these accessibility accommodations, like Spiel at Essen, they're one of the big German board game conventions, has 7 halls and 1 gender-neutral bathroom. At least they have a gender-neutral bathroom, but it's all the way in the back of hall 6, and all our gender-neutral fences go all the way to the back of hall 6 to go to the bathroom. And that bathroom, by the way, stairs going down. So if you can't use stairs for any reason, it's tough. So the thing is that not all of this is the fault of the games industry. A lot of it is like wider societal issues. But the idea here is that if you have any power to enact any kind of change at all, then that change becomes more normal. Like, I forgot to put my pronouns. I did forget. But the fact that we all have our pronouns listed is a sea change, right? Like, this is normal now. And it's not like something that is a new idea. And the idea here is that the more things become normal and the less that there are new ideas, the familiarity of it will start to seep through. I will say, just before I close, that most of the people that I have met in the industry are not opposed to changing things. The trolls are very loud, but most of the people in the industry, most of the people who actually have power, they're not opposed to changing things. It's just that they may not know how to change things, or they're not aware that things need to change. Like, very common example, right? A little while ago, it became very trendy and good, in a good way, for character art to have two sides, like a masculine side and a feminine side, right? And this sounds great on the face, but also then you're excluding all of the people who don't fit into either of the gender binaries, right? So it's a step forward, but it's like we could go further, right? We could take that further. I remember speaking to a very famous head of the game publishing studio, and he said, of course it's a no-brainer. You have man on one side, woman on the other side, and then I didn't say to him at the time, then what about the people who aren't men or women? Right? How do they fit in here? But when I spoke to him, that was 6 years ago, I think, and awareness has moved forward since then. And while there will always be holdouts, people who get very uncomfortable and grumpy when you try to make them adjust to the fact that we live in a plural and multicultural society, and these people make your games. I think really the main thing is that I do see that it's trending good. The doctor's research was looking at the top 200, but if you look at I'm sure if you extend that to the top 1,000, you're going to see the numbers shoot up on the rest of the sides of the graph, right? Yeah, exactly. It's just that it takes time for some of the 20-year-old classics to get dislodged from the top 200 list, and it's fine. I think the industry. Yeah, I think the industry is moving forward in good ways. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, and one of the good ways, I want to pull in KC here, because one of the good ways it's moving forward is we're seeing, and you'll pardon my Marxism here, we're seeing that the masses seizing the means of production and starting their own game companies. Nibcard Games, I want to start with this fact, which I find interesting. So Nibcard Games makes great games. You can go to their website, you can buy their games, but not but, I shouldn't say but, it's not a but. One of the neat things I saw there, you have 4 or 5 games that are sort of inspired by African and Nigerian culture, and each one, the name of it is in a different language. So, we Cal and Dr. Pobeda were talking about how nobody's a monolith. And in Nigeria, that's exceedingly true, where, you have different cultures and different languages, within blocks of each other.
Yeah. The funny thing is that I designed my first game. When people ask me how did all of this happen, I usually use one word. It was boredom. But over the years and in retrospect, yes, a lot has happened. And when I think about it, I would say I just before I designed my first game, I've never seen a four-sided die, or it was just the six-sided dice, and I didn't even know there was stuff called modern classic games. I've never heard of Uno, not to mention the modern classics that we know now. So, but at the time, I designed a game that I could relate in with, a game that could just tell my own story or what I felt the story of, in quote, a young man living in Nigeria would look like. So the game had just a quick review of the game. So the game had 4 stages. So there was the growing up stage, and it was things that I could relate with. So things like wash someone's car and get paid so amount of money, and then it gets to an adult stage where you start acquiring more skills, and then it gets to the stage where you start earning from your skills, and then it gets to the stage where you become like the big boss. Because those are things I could relate with. And I think those are there that I think that there are things I started building on. Now, what do I want to see in games? Just like Dr. Kyle's presentation and Calvin's session showed, where if you look at the games, you're seeing so many things that you do not understand. Now, I've had conversations with people where we use the chessboard, for instance. In primary school, I was taught that the king is the king. The king is the strongest person. And then when I look at the chessboard, that is not what I'm seeing. And if you kill the king, game ends. But in terms of who moves around the board, it's not the king. And then if I look at my society and I begin to wonder, how does religious people go to war and start killing people? I mean, my mind and the chessboard can't relate unless I just want to play based on logic. But if you think about it, in the medieval time, those things were real, right? And it was a representation of people. So I think that was what started my drive in designing, and it actually started in 2015. But every other thing was because of need. For 2015, I said, okay, I could do this game. And I remember I designed a game from a movie I watched, and the movie was more about my tribe. But at the time, I was in the city of Lagos, and I hope my story, in sort of way, begins to bring out the points I've written down, listening to Dr. Tanya and Calvin. So when my game was done, I was now looking for where to make the game, and I was in Lagos. Lagos, the busiest city in Africa, arguably. So I wouldn't want to argue with people. But in Lagos, you have over 9 million people in that city, and I was there for, and I trekked. Well, I tell people I trekked not because I just wanted to trek, but y- you can't enter a car to a place you don't know. So it better you walk from shop to shop, right? And I was asking people, can I? Do you have any idea how I could make this from the idea stage where it is, or the prototype, the very very not fancy prototype, to a box that people can play on the table? And I couldn't find that. And that is one of the challenges, right? We are talking about the challenges and opportunities of seeing yourself in games, and that was the first challenge, that there are no human resources. And if you go to my timeline, I'm like jack of all trade, and frankly, it's very draining. But if I don't do that, it's like sitting on a chair, right, where one of the legs, is bad. You will fall and you will crash. So everything has to stand if you want people to be comfortable in that chair. So you see, now I have to design a game. I have to run a cafe to entertain people with the game. I have to manage a group of young people to manufacture the game. I have to create a website where I have to promote people to play the game. And then there's the content creation part, which I'm kind of enjoying now, but I don't necessarily have to do it, right? So, and before I started creation this year, I've been putting up flyers all over social media, created a banner everywhere asking for content creators. You have free access to the cafe and to the game. You don't pay, just come create content. And I'll talk later about why I brought this up. So, I think one of the challenges is the human resource part. There's obviously the financial resource part, but that is the major. And I began to think about it in a broader view, where how does the global community reach out to minority states about tabletop games? Because Nigeria, I could speak for Nigeria. Nigeria plays games a lot. It's hard for you to walk through a street and not see people playing the old classic. I mean, like draft, Ludo, Monopoly, chess, Scrabble. It's so difficult for you to walk through a street and not see a group playing it. In fact, in 2015, a Nigerian won the global Scrabble competition, right? And then last year, I think they came. There are three Nigerians in the first 10. So we play games, but how come even 4 years after opening the cafe, people still walk in to Abuja, and Abuja is the capital of Nigeria. So Abuja is probably like, that's where the fancy people live, the people who there's a high probability that they probably traveled out of the country. How come they walk into the cafe and they are mesmerized? You see it, and I always try to hold my peace. Like, whoa, these are all games. Like, yes, and I try to even make it normal by saying, oh, board game gig released in 2020 21. There are over 5,000 games were released on just their platform. So I try to normalize it because it's too much. I feel I don't want to use the word ashamed, but like I feel embarrassed. Like people walk in 4 years after we are open in Abuja, so that means I could take it to one of Nigeria's 36 states, apart from this federal capital territory, and they would literally be blown away. I take games out to places and people don't know about it. So I sometimes I talk with my game masters and we're discussing how to help people understand more of the value chain and start filling up. But there is so much we can do, that if the global tabletop games company begin to see this, like people will not necessarily want to give in their time or their money unless some sort of supernatural passion. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know. I when I was quitting my job, people thought I was mad. I don't know what happened to me, but people need some sort of knowledge, right? To and see that there are viable opportunities for them to be willing to say, okay, let me try it out and put in this amount of time or amount of skills or even amount of money into this industry. And but when they see that, okay, this is the probably the only guy doing this stuff, and then they do a quick search on Google and they this the only guy doing this stuff. Then now they are a bit withdrawn, right? So they are watching, and if they are watching, this year is probably 10th. Yeah, designed my game 10 years ago, and they are watching and they are seeing this growth. This is not where I want to put in my money. So it brings. So okay, so let me come back to what I was talking about. So there's the human resource gap, and I feel that there's the knowledge gap that is causing that human resource gap. Because I also have communicated with people in different African countries, mostly West African countries, and they're having it worse, worse. So, I would say that over the past 4 5 years, I've uh, maybe through conversations with people like Eric Lang, uh, my very good mentor and partner, Cowrie Games owner Aaron Brown, even Calvin. Calvin has been supporting us for over 3 years, like on Twitter and Instagram. Sorry, I have to say this, Calvin, but things that I read on tweet, the knowledge I get on tweet has a lot of impact on me as well. For instance, when I used to write rule books, I usually use he because the old classics that I was learning how to play were saying he did this, but it was because I was reading conversation tweets, Facebook posts from these people, and I was like, oh, it has to be they, right? So for some people, I had to send them my rule book, and they're like, Casey, remove all he. It has to be they. So either I use the player wins or I use they win. No, so before I could just use the, and that's because there is that knowledge gap that happened, right? So I'm looking at a situation where there's that there's that partnership. When I say partnership, I mean where there is okay. Let me listen to you and not just let me throw support at you because those are two different things, right? There is oh, Casey is doing something beautiful. Let's send him games, and then they send me games. I have these games. There are games that we've had here for 4 years. I have not opened it because my community are not even ready. Even me, I'm so scared of opening the game, and all of us we all look at it and say, "Whoa!" And then we'll go back to fast-paced games and jolly games and very easy games. So, and that's because there was no that conversation. Now, how do we begin to fill these gaps and not just throwing games at don't get me wrong. I appreciate games, even from the perspective from manufacturer perspective. I open games to see what can we do. I look at insights. I'm seeing. I'm getting new knowledge. But again, I'm also thinking on the broader view because pe- people might think, oh, we supported this minority group by sending them games, but that there is it's so far, and it also provides opportunities because that opportunity is now, like Calvin was saying, is now you begin to even before you sit down to decide the artwork. Now there is now interaction. You begin to say, okay, this can happen, and it's a partnership. It becomes a partnership, right? And
Yeah.
then
Unfortunately,
one of
Casey, unfortunately, we are running up on time here. So what I want to do is I want to give everybody a quick chance. Casey, tell folks where they can find you.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
No.
You can always find me on Nipcat Games. You can just type Nipcat Games on social media. You see Nipcat Games, or type it on Google. You see our website www.nipcatgames.com, and you see it.
And I also want to plug your AB Con, the African Board Game Con. They do Kickstarters for that. That is, there you go. That is well worth supporting. It is bringing games to a whole new audience. That is super exciting. Cal, where can folks find you? You're on mute again.
Mostly Twitter.
There we
Mostly
go.
Twitter.
At Ithalia. Ithala. Oh, see, I didn't pronounce it right. And Dr. Pobeda, where can folks find you?
You can find me my website, TanyaPobeda.phd.com, and on Twitter as well.
And again,
Yep.
we have scratched the surface. Like, all three of these folks could have gone an hour alone. I did them a disservice by but it's just so cool to have them all together. You can find us on the Discord where we'll be talking. Thank you, Casey, Cal, Tanya. This has been amazing. Thanks, folks, for watching. Goodbye, Big Bad Con friends.